Welcome back, Western Civ. Today we're here to talk about the Atlantic slave trade, and we're going to be building off what we talked about yesterday with the rise of colonies and of this overseas empire that the Spanish had in the North and South Americas. Now, due to this huge empire, they're going to start up the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade was used at first primarily by the Caribbean islands and their sugar production, but it's going to spread to the entire North and South America. It's a very, very unfortunate process. It's got a lot of prospers, but a lot of horrific things that happened as well. Now remember, don't forget that the encomienda system was used first, and then when the natives started to die, they had to start bringing in slaves. Now, they did this secondly because slaves were very expensive. But let's go ahead and get started. So, the triangle trade. The triangle trade is a three-legged trade network that spanned from Europe to Africa, to North America, and then back around again. So it keeps going in a circle. It's a cycle, even though it keeps going in this triangle, right? So a lot of people, though, also think that the triangular trade was only for slaves, like just for shipping slaves. But that's not true. It's actually the trade network that kept these colonies producing. It kept Europe fat, happy, and rich. And then it's just going to really hurt the African continent, though, however. So the first leg is when merchant ships are going to bring goods from Europe to Africa. They're going to bring things like guns, cloth, which is also known as textiles, and cash. Now, which of these three things right here do you think the Africans wanted the most? That is exactly right, William Morales. Very good job. And Robert Wolfram, pay attention. This is the guns right here. The guns are the things that they wanted the most because Africans could use them to hunt better. They could use them to go to war with other tribes, things like that. So the cash they didn't really have a lot of use for because who were they going to give it to? I mean, to them it was nothing. The cloth, though, is also very important because they could really, really use it. So now the second leg, also known as the Middle Passage, is when slaves are going to be transported from from Africa to the Americas. So now the slaves were used primarily on sugar plantations at first, and then they're going to start being used on rice plantations, and then as well as tobacco. Now cotton's going to be the main thing they're used for, like right before the American Civil War, but that's a couple hundred years down the road. So remember, the prime location for the slaves at first was the sugar-producing islands in the Caribbean. That's where they went primarily. That is why a lot of these Caribbean islands are heavily populated by African descendant people, like Jamaica and Haiti, and Puerto Rico actually has a very large population of African Hispanic people. So it's very, very important that you understand that. That very fancy word. What's that word again? Good job, Dominique. Cultural diffusion. Attaway champ. Now, slaves are going to be transported from Africa to the Americas. Now, the better question is, though, is how do you think the Europeans actually got a hold of these Africans? Like, where did they go? Did they go to a store? No, of course not. How do you think they got them? Take a second. Think about it. Very, very good job. That's the exact right answer to who is that back there? Who is that? I see you. Don't worry. Who is that? That's a very, very good answer, Maureen Diamond. Very nice. Now, slaves were actually going to be given to the Europeans by other Africans. Africans would take over another tribe, bring those people on as their slaves, and then those African tribes are going to sell them to white Europeans. So slaves are going to be picked up at forts in Africa, and slaves are going to be transported on these huge slave vessels that hold about 500 people per person, or per boat, excuse me. Now, the third leg was when merchants carried things like sugar, molasses, cotton, rum, tobacco, and other plantation products. All of these right here, they're called what kind of materials again? What kind of materials are these? Very, very close, Josh Hall, but that's not right. Raw materials. They're all called raw materials. Now, the cycle is going to start all over again, though, with the first leg. So this just keeps going round and round and round and round and round. So this is what it looks like all together. So as you can see, starts in Europe, goes to Africa, hits the sugar islands, comes back again. Now, it's not only going to go here. It's going to eventually spread to North America with the plantations here, like I said, rice, tobacco. And then it's going to spread down here as well with things like the large sugar plantations that were used in the Central Americas and South America. So now there are, unfortunately, some positives to this trade. Now, it's a savage thing altogether, and I don't like it as a historian, and it's very awful that a whole group of people were completely subjugated. But it is going to make a lot of money. It's going to generate a ton of money. The trade process itself, not the action of selling slaves. So, cultural diffusion, of course. And then also, international relations are going to grow, and it's going to help establish new countries. the USA may never have originated without this. It's very important to remember. Now, the negatives of it, though, however, is ships going to very easily be lost at sea. This is going to increase our dependency on slavery, and it's also going to promote a huge amount of racism. So, continuing forward, though, trade is going to cause a lot of cities to grow. The slave trade especially helped cities in North America grow very, very fast and make a ton of money, especially the port cities, the ones on the coastline, like your Charlestons and your Cubas and your, what's another good one? Well, the ones on the coastline. So now, without the slave trade, though, the U.S. may never have grown into what it is today. However, this may have been one of the most horrific things around, because the Middle Passage is going to have its own set of just awful, awful, horrific things. Now, for merchants, it's going to be very necessary, but for the slaves, it was a horror story. As you can see right here, the slaves were packed together, and if they weren't sitting up, then they were actually chained to one another laying down. All right, so most Africans were taken from inland villages after being enslaved, and they were forced to march from coastal ports. Now, this is an old Prezi, so I'm just kind of giving you an idea, okay? Now, this is right here is the school I used to teach at, Northern High School, but now I teach at the illustrious Camden Catholic, so I don't really need to worry about it. I need to change this Prezi. But hypothetically, and as you can see, it's kind of crusty. So most Africans were taken from inland villages, but I do miss my kids over here. After being enslaved, they were forced to march to coastal ports. Men, women, and children were bound together with chains and forced to walk distances up to 1,000 miles from the interior of Africa all the way to the ports where they were picked up for the triangle trade. So that is the same as walking chained together from Durham, North Carolina, where I'm from, to New York City and then back again. That is insane. It takes like 10 hours to get there in a car. So it takes several days chained together and walking together. Now, if someone died, though, do you think they had the tools to disconnect the chain? No, because then some of the slaves could get away. So basically, the bodies were just dragged for several hundred miles until they fell off, or they cut the person off itself. So this right here is how the slaves are going to be crammed into the boats itself. Now, the slaves ended up calling these things floating coffins, because around 90% of the slaves were picked up at West Coast African ports in countries like Ghana and the Ivory Coast. Slaves were crammed below decks in chains, and they were stacked, as you can see right here. Some of them were, anyway. So the journey to the Americas lasted anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months. Now imagine being slapped down here, chained together, and treated like a commodity instead of a person. And then also, the worst part about it is there were no bathroom breaks. So if you were on one of the lower levels, it was very bad for you. And they're just going to be huge breeding grounds for disease. The ships faced many, many risks, though, like storms and pirates. If pirates came on to actually commandeer the vessel, did they care about the people on there? No, not at all. They didn't care about the slaves because they couldn't use them. They wanted the things on it, and then they would just sink the boat, killing almost 500 people at once. And then also, let's say hypothetically, we're on our vessel, and then all of our people are chained together, right? And then one of the slaves gets a disease. Let's say he gets dysentery or something like that. The slave traders would actually take the end of the chain and then throw that entire link of people off the side of the vessel and kill all of them because they didn't have the time to cut them out. It's a very, very awful process. Now remember, this is all called the Middle Passage. So aboard these floating coffins, though, around half of the slaves died from disease and starvation and gross mistreatment. So many slaves are going to kill themselves also just to avoid enslavement. This is a very, very horrific process. And lastly, the impact of the slave trade is that many African cities and villages and societies are going to fall apart due to the slave trade, while American cities are going to grow. And I mean American like North America, South America, not the U.S. Don't think so centered. Now, about 2,000 slaves were sent to the Americas every year in the 1500s. By the 1700s, that number grew to 80,000 people a year. By the 1800s, 11 million slaves had reached the Americas until it was finally outlawed in Washington, D.C. during the 1820s. Now, another 2 million that died because of the slave trade. That's 2 million people that 2 million people that died from this just process altogether. But this is very important that you understand. And during the 1800s, actually, the population of the United States is going to be 37% enslaved people. So I really appreciate you watching this. I hope you all have a fantastic evening. I'm going to be checking this flip notes tomorrow. Have a good evening.